The rescue in the rain asterisk. The storm had not stopped for 3 days, and the sky was still dark and heavy with clouds. Trees bent under the weight of rain, and the ground was soft like soaked paper. Jake, a lone human soldier, walked slowly through the jungle, holding his broken helmet in one hand and a small flashlight in the other. His ship had crashed a week ago, and the emergency signal had not brought help yet. His boots were torn, and his leg bled from a deep cut. He moved one step at a time, not because of pain, but because something was crying nearby. It was not human, but it sounded weak and helpless. Jake turned off his light and followed the sound through thick branches and leaves. That's when he saw the tiny figure shivering in the mud, stuck between 2 rocks. It was a creature, small and furry, with large ears and glowing eyes. It looked like a puppy, but not from Earth. Its front paw was twisted, and its body trembled like it had been cold for too long. Jake bent down, whispering softly to it as he reached into his bag for a dry cloth. The creature growled weakly, then collapsed. Jake picked it up and wrapped it in the cloth. He tried to feed it water, but the creature turned its head away, refusing to drink. Jake looked around for a dry place to rest, but there was only forest and endless rain. Then out of the fog, a shape appeared, tall, silent, and not human. He froze in place, keeping one hand near his belt where his sidearm hung. The figure stepped closer. It was a woman, tall and alien. Her skin was greenish gold, glowing softly under the dim light, and her silver eyes didn't blink. She had long hair tied in braids and armor made from leaves and vines, but she was not holding a weapon. She walked up to Jake, slowly and without fear. Her gaze moved from him to the bundle in his arms. She reached out, and he stepped back, warning her with a glare, but she pointed to the puppy, then gently placed a hand on her own chest. Jake didn't understand, but something about her felt calm, not dangerous. Then she did something strange. She sat down on her knees, reached into her robe, and carefully exposed her chest. A moment later, she pulled the puppy from Jake's arms and held it to her body. The puppy whimpered, then began to feed, not from a bottle but from her. Jake stood frozen, his mouth half open. He had seen many things in war, but this wasn't one of them. The alien woman looked down at the small creature with quiet care. Her expression never changed, but her breathing slowed like a lullaby. It was the most natural thing she had ever done. Jake didn't know what to say. Was she the mother? Was this part of her species' way of care? He wasn't sure, but he lowered his weapon and slowly sat down on a nearby stone. He watched in silence, the rain tapping gently on their heads. The puppy fed without fear, curled in her arms like it belonged. After a few minutes, she looked at Jake and tilted her head. She motioned for him to follow, then stood up with the puppy still in her arms. Jake hesitated, but then stood too. He couldn't leave the puppy, and he couldn't let her walk off alone with it. Together, they moved through the forest, deeper into the unknown. The rain slowed as they reached a part of the jungle that glowed faintly with blue moss and hanging lights from the trees. The alien woman walked like she knew every step, never slipping, never stumbling. Jake followed behind, one hand still near his belt, just in case, but the farther they went, the safer it felt. Finally, she stopped near a cluster of large stones covered in thick moss. She placed the puppy down on a bed of soft leaves and wrapped it in her long scarf. Then she turned and looked at Jake again. Her eyes said something he couldn't translate, but he knew it was important. She tapped her chest once and said one word, "Lyra." Jake nodded slowly and replied with his own name, Jake. Her lips moved softly as if tasting the sound. Then she gave a small bow and sat beside the puppy again, gently stroking its back as it slept. Jake sat down opposite her, his wet clothes sticking to his body. For a long time they sat in silence, two strangers from two worlds, connected by one tiny life. The forest whispered around them, and the storm faded into soft mist. Jake didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't walk away from her. The alien silence asterisk. The forest looked alive, not like Earth's jungle, but something older and deeper. Trees whispered in a language Jake didn't understand, yet somehow they made him feel watched. Lyra walked ahead of him, silent as wind, holding the small alien puppy like a treasure. Her feet never snapped a twig, never disturbed a leaf, as if the world had shaped itself around her. Jake had tried to speak a few times, but she didn't answer. She didn't seem afraid of him, but she didn't trust words either. Every time he said something, she would pause, tilt her head, and look at him with eyes full of meaning but no reply. It was like speaking to the forest itself, mysterious, quiet, and old. Still, she helped him. Every wound he had from the crash, she touched with her fingers and rubbed with thick green sap that smelled like pine and smoke. The pain faded quickly, and the swelling on his leg went down overnight. Jake didn't understand how it worked, but it did, and he began to feel strength returning to his body. They reached a hidden grove, shielded by tree roots and glowing moss. The light came not from the sky, but from the plants themselves, pulsing blue and green. The puppy whimpered softly, hungry again, and Lyra didn't hesitate. She fed it from herself with calm grace, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Jake sat nearby, eating berries she had handed him earlier. At first he'd been suspicious, but when he saw her eat the same ones, he trusted them. The taste was sweet, with a strange warm feeling after each bite. He could tell this place was sacred, not just to her, but maybe to her whole kind. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He watched her across the fire she built using only dried roots and a strange glowing stone. She sat with her eyes closed, holding the puppy. Her hair shined under the cave's crystal light, and her chest rose and fell with slow peace. She looked like a painting carved from nature. Jake whispered to himself, "What are you?" Not expecting an answer, but Lyra's eyes opened, and she looked at him for the first time. She placed her hand over her heart, then reached out and gently pressed it to his. Her hand was warm, and her skin smelled like wild herbs. Then she looked away without speaking. He felt something change inside him, a pull, not just attraction, but connection. She didn't know his language, yet somehow she understood parts of him better than any human had in years. And he was beginning to understand her too, not with words, but with silence, with looks, and with the way she cared for the weak. The next day, Lyra took him deeper into the glowing trees. She showed him how to pull clean water from vines and how to collect dry bark without disturbing the bugs hiding inside. Jake followed carefully, learning every movement. Every time he did something wrong, she gently corrected him with a touch or gesture. In a clearing filled with floating seeds, she showed him how to make a whistle using a carved stick and a leaf. When he blew through it, a soft bird-like sound came out, and within seconds, colorful creatures flew down from the trees. Lyra held her hand out, and one of them landed on her fingers without fear. Jake laughed softly, unable to believe what he was seeing. He tried the same, and one of the flying animals landed on his shoulder, chirping gently. Lyra smiled, a soft upward curve of her lips, so small, but so full of meaning. It was the first time he saw her truly smile. Later, they sat near a crystal pond where the water glowed from within. The puppy played beside them, stronger now, biting at floating petals. Lyra watched it proudly, then looked at Jake. Her hand reached out again and brushed his hair back gently, like he was part of her world now. He wanted to speak, to tell her about Earth, about the war, about why he had been on her planet in the first place. But every time he opened his mouth, the words felt heavy, unimportant. Compared to the quiet truth between them, she didn't care about his rank, his weapons, or his orders. She cared that he had carried the puppy, that he hadn't pulled the trigger, that he sat with her by the fire, sharing food in silence. And when she leaned her head gently against his shoulder, Jake didn't move, didn't speak. He only listened to the trees breathing around them. In that sacred silence, Jake finally understood this alien woman didn't need to talk to change. Someone's life, her actions, her calm, and her care spoke louder than words ever could. And even though they came from different worlds, he realized he didn't feel lost anymore. A hidden refuge asterisk. The cave entrance was hidden behind thick vines and a waterfall that sang like 1,000 voices. Lyra walked through it without a word, and Jake followed, ducking under the rushing water as cold drops splashed his face. On the other side, a warm air hit his skin, and light spilled over everything. Not from fire, but from the rocks themselves. Inside the cave, the walls glowed with a soft blue light. Crystals grew from the ceiling like teeth of stars, and flowers bloomed from stone with petals that pulsed gently like breathing. Jake had never seen anything like this place. It was a world untouched by war, secret and alive. Lyra stopped and turned, as if asking him silently, "Do you understand now?" She knelt beside a small pool and set the puppy down. The creature ran ahead, barking excitedly, as if it remembered this place. There were others, tiny alien animals with wings, scales and fur. All of them moved toward Lyra, chirping and calling like children welcoming their mother. Jake looked around in awe. Some animals were missing legs, eyes, or tails, but none of them looked afraid. They weren't hiding from him. They trusted Lyra completely, and they accepted him too. Just because she did. She was more than just a survivor. She was a guardian. He watched her move from one animal to the next, applying paste to wounds, whispering to each in soft humming tones. The injured purred and cooed in response. Some even curled against her body as she worked. It was clear she had done this for a long time. Jake stepped forward to help. At first, his hands shook. He wasn't trained for care, just combat. But Lyra gently guided him, placing a healing leaf in his palm, pointing at a small injured bird. Jake wrapped its wing carefully as she watched, then smiled with pride when the bird chirped happily. She nodded in approval and motioned for him to follow. Deeper in the cave, there was a hollow filled with tall glass-like plants that stretched toward the roof. Between them were soft nests, woven with moss, feathers, and threads of silver. It felt like a place made for healing, not for fighting. Jake realized this was her sanctuary. Built over time, hidden from the world, protected by silence. He looked at her again, trying to understand how such a person could exist in the middle of war. But then he remembered he had also been trained to destroy, until one act of mercy changed everything. Lyra pulled out a flat carved stone and handed it to him. It was warm and had strange symbols etched into it. She placed it near a wall, and suddenly, a soft hum echoed as crystal light flowed over the surface. Images began to appear, moving pictures of a long ago time. He saw her people dancing under the moons, children playing in glowing fields, families laughing around a fire. Then the images changed: ships falling from the sky, fires burning forests, machines marching across the ground, and Lyra kneeling alone, watching it all crumble around her. She tapped her chest again. "Healer," she said slowly, then made an X over her heart. No war. Jake swallowed hard, realizing she had refused to fight. And for that, she had lost everything. Her people were either gone or hiding like her. The puppy curled up next to Jake and placed its head on his foot. It had stopped shaking, and its eyes were bright again. He reached down and patted its head, smiling without thinking. Then he looked back at Lyra and felt something shift deep in his chest. That night, they sat near a natural fire pit where the walls shimmered like stars. Jake told her about Earth, not the war, but the rivers, trees, mountains, and music. She listened without blinking, her silver eyes full of wonder. He drew maps on the stone floor, and she copied them with her finger. She showed him her songs, sung without words, only humming and soft rhythm tapped with her fingers on stone. The animals gathered around them, eyes half closed, as if the music was a kind of safety. Jake joined in slowly, adding beats with small stones. They didn't need to speak the same tongue anymore. Later, as they lay near the fire, the puppy nestled between them, Lyra reached out and gently touched Jake's forehead. Her hand lingered there for a moment, then slid down to his heart. She looked at him, not like a soldier, not like a stranger, but like someone who had earned a place here. Jake didn't move, didn't breathe too loud, afraid the moment might break. In that glowing cave, surrounded by life, he felt something he hadn't known in years. Peace, not the kind found after victory, but the kind born from connection, from something simple and pure. The human within asterisk. The sun never reached this part of the forest, but the cave glowed with its own quiet light. Each morning, Jake awoke beside the fire to the soft hum of Lyra's voice. Her tone never changed, yet every sound felt like it meant something, a gentle greeting to the animals, to the cave, and maybe to him. Jake had started building things, simple tools. A better bed, a water filter using crystals and moss. He wanted to be useful, to give something back. Lyra always watched him silently, sometimes helping with a nod or a small correction. Her eyes never judged him, only observed. He found pieces of his crashed ship weeks ago. Torn metal hidden in vines, cracked panels half buried in mud. Some were useless, but others still held power cells and wiring. Jake started collecting them in secret, not because he wanted to leave, but because something inside him knew he had to be prepared. One day, as he tinkered near the stream, Lyra came and sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't ask what he was doing, she simply watched. Jake showed her the blinking light of the transmitter, and her face changed for the first time. Not anger, not fear, but quiet understanding. She stood up and walked away. Jake didn't follow her. He knew what she was thinking. When the signal reached orbit, others would come. Maybe they wouldn't understand her like he did. Maybe they'd see her as an enemy, a threat, just like the first orders had said. That night, Lyra didn't sit beside the fire. She stayed near the far side of the cave, arms around the sleeping puppy. Her back was turned to him, and for the first time since they met, the silence between them felt cold. Jake lay awake, staring at the shadows dancing on the walls. He couldn't sleep, so he got up and walked to the pool of glowing water. He saw his reflection, a tired soldier, face rough, hair grown out, eyes full of things he didn't want to name. He had come to this planet ready to survive by killing. Now he wasn't sure who he was anymore. When he turned around, Lyra stood behind him. She had followed without a sound. Her eyes were softer now, but guarded. Jake stepped closer and reached for her hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold him either. She looked at the sky through the cracks in the cave roof. Then she placed his hand on her shoulder and gently tapped the scar beneath her collarbone. It was old, maybe from before the war, maybe from someone else's cruelty. Jake didn't ask. He simply pressed his hand there and nodded. Her eyes shimmered with light, not from the crystals, but from something deeper. The next day, they left the cave for the first time in weeks. Lyra led him to a quiet grove surrounded by white trees and blue grass. There, in silence, she showed him a mound of stone and vine, an old grave, covered with her people's symbols. Jake bowed his head, even though he didn't know the name. She placed a flower there and whispered something in her own tongue. Her voice cracked, the first sound of pain he had ever heard from her. Jake stepped beside her and placed his hand on the stone. It didn't matter who it was, family, friend, or tribe, he knew they had mattered. On the walk back they were attacked. A beast with black skin and 6 limbs lunged from the shadows, fangs flashing. Jake grabbed a branch and swung, but it knocked him aside with one strike. Lyra stepped between them, raising her arm and releasing a blast of blinding green light. The creature howled and fled, leaving a trail of burning footprints. But Lyra stumbled and fell, blood running down her side. Jake caught her before she hit the ground. His heart raced. He had never seen her injured before. And suddenly, all the quiet understanding between them meant nothing if she died. He carried her back through the forest, pushing past branches and thorns, ignoring the sting of cuts on his skin. Back in the cave, he placed her near the fire and rushed to gather the herbs she had once used on him. His hands shook, but he focused, remembering everything she taught. Him, the puppy, whimpered beside her, licking her face. Jake cleaned the wound, crushed the herbs, wrapped her with soft vines soaked in the glowing pool water. He sang her hums back to her, the same ones she had once whispered to the animals. This time, the music was for her. He didn't sleep, didn't move from her side. Just watched her chest rise and fall, slowly, painfully. Hours passed like years, but finally, her fingers twitched and her lips parted. She opened her eyes and saw him, and for the first time, she spoke in his tongue just one word. Stay. A healing touch asterisk. The cave felt different after she fell. The light from the crystal seemed dimmer, and the animals didn't chirp or crawl near the fire. The puppy sat beside Lyra, ears low and eyes wide, while Jake stayed close, wiping sweat from her brow with a soft leaf soaked in cool water. Every movement he made was slow and careful. Not like a soldier, but like someone afraid to break something precious. The wound on Lyra's side had stopped bleeding, but her breath was shallow. The herbal wrap glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Jake watched, holding her hand with both of his. He whispered her name again and again, not knowing if she could hear, not caring if she couldn't. He needed her to stay awake, to stay alive. She had saved him more times than he could count, and now it was his turn. His voice shook with every word, but he kept speaking anyway. I'm here, he said. I won't leave. His voice wasn't strong, but it was steady. He sat through the night beside her, feeding the fire and checking her breath. The puppy licked her fingers, trying to wake her, as if it could sense how fragile she was. By morning, Lyra stirred slightly, her fingers twitching in Jake's hand. He leaned forward, barely breathing, waiting for more. She didn't open her eyes, but her lips moved, just enough to hum a single note. It was weak and broken, but it was hers. That sound gave him hope. He crushed more herbs, poured water into a carved stone bowl, and kept the healing paste fresh. He whispered the same song back to her, letting the rhythm guide his hands. The cave, once full of strange silence, now echoed with their quiet melody. On the second night, her breathing grew stronger. She still didn't speak, but she turned her head slightly toward him. Jake pressed his forehead gently to hers and closed his eyes. He had carried guns, led missions, and faced death, but this was the first time he felt truly afraid. He knew now that it wasn't the cave that gave him peace, or the puppy, or even the glowing forest. It was her. Everything about her, her quiet strength, her gentle care, her wild grace, had reached him, changed him, made him someone he didn't recognize but finally respected. On the third day, Lyra opened her eyes, just barely. She looked at Jake, her lips parting as if to speak, but only breath came out. Jake held a leaf to her mouth, letting a drop of sweet juice fall on her tongue. She swallowed slowly, her throat moving with effort. Then softly she said, Jake. His name on her lips made his heart stop. It was the first time she had said it, not whispered, not hummed, but spoken. Jake smiled with tears in his eyes, brushing her hair back as he whispered, I told you I'd stay. She reached weakly toward the puppy, who jumped into her arms. With a soft bark, Lyra pressed her face into its fur and closed her eyes again. This time in rest, not weakness. Jake watched her sleep, feeling a quiet victory warm his chest. Days passed, and she grew stronger. Soon she could sit up, then stand with his help. She began humming again, though softer, and the animals returned. They climbed over her lap, nuzzled her face, and licked her hands, welcoming her back to the living. Jake didn't leave her side, not even when his transmitter blinked a green light, meaning someone had heard it. Help was on the way. He stared at the blinking signal, then shut it inside a pouch, burying it under a stone near the pool. That night, as they sat beside the fire, Lyra looked at Jake for a long time. Then she placed her hand on her chest and tapped it twice, slowly, deliberately. Yours, she said. The word was simple, but it hit like thunder in his heart. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached forward, took her hand, and held it tight against his chest. She felt the beat of his heart, steady and real, and smiled without needing to speak again. That smile was the only thing he needed. The puppy barked softly and curled up between them. It had grown stronger too. Its fur now thick and shiny, it looked up at them, then closed its eyes and slept without fear. Jake stroked its back once, then looked at Lyra again. His voice was quiet but firm. "If they come," he said, "I'll protect this place." The choice asterisk, a low rumble broke the morning calm. Shaking birds from trees and stirring animals from their nests, Jake stood outside the cave, staring at the sky. A red flare blinked above the clouds, falling slowly like a warning from the stars. The rescue ship was coming. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He turned and looked behind him where Lyra stood holding the puppy in her arms. Her silver eyes watched the flare, then moved to Jake. No words passed between them, only silence deeper. Then the cave itself. Jake had sent the signal weeks ago, back when he thought survival meant getting off this planet. But now he knew survival meant more than just escape. It meant protecting this forest, this sanctuary, this woman who had healed him without asking for anything in return. They packed what they could: berries, roots, herbs, crystal water, and vine-wrapped gourds. Jake carried a knife made from a carved tusk and a satchel of metal pieces he no longer needed. He buried his helmet near the pool, marking it with a stone, not as a goodbye but as a choice. The ship landed in a wide clearing beyond the trees, its engines burning the grass into ash. Soldiers poured out in black armor, scanning the jungle with sharp eyes and sharper weapons. Jake walked into view with his hands up. Lyra stayed behind the trees, hidden from sight. "Sergeant Jake Morrow?" The officer barked, raising a visor. Jake nodded, slowly and carefully. His uniform was gone. His skin was dirty, and vines wrapped around his arms like soft armor. The officer stared at him like he was something broken, forgotten in the wild. "We received your signal," the man said. "You're lucky, thought you were dead." Jake glanced at the ship, then back at the man. "I survived," he replied, "but I'm not leaving." The officer blinked, unsure he heard correctly. "Excuse me?" he said. Jake stood tall, even barefoot in the dirt. "I'm not coming with you," he said again. "There's someone here, someone who saved my life, and I won't let you take this place from her." The officer looked past him into the trees, reaching for his weapon. "She's the enemy," he said. "You know the orders." Jake stepped forward and raised his voice. "She's a healer, not a fighter," he said. "She feeds orphan creatures, she sings them to sleep, and she bleeds when she protects others. Does that sound like a soldier to you?" The officer hesitated, his squad behind him silent, unsure. "We can't trust her," he said. "We can't risk it." Jake lowered his voice and stepped closer. "If you fire that weapon," he said, "you'll have to shoot through me first." His words carried more weight than any command. Behind him, Lyra stepped from the trees, carrying the puppy in her arms. Her eyes were calm, her body straight. She stood with dignity, not fear. The puppy barked once, then quieted, sensing the tension in the air. The soldiers stared at her, fingers twitching on triggers, but none fired. Jake stood between them and her, arms wide. "She's not your enemy," he said again. "She's life in the middle of all this death, and I'm staying with her." The officer lowered his rifle. Slowly, "We'll report this," he said. "They won't be happy back on Earth." Jake nodded. "Let them be unhappy," he said. "I finally found something worth protecting." The officer stared a moment longer, then turned back to the ship and gave the order to retreat. The engines roared as the ship lifted off, sending dust and leaves into the sky. Jake watched until it vanished, only smoke trails left in the air. Then he turned and walked back to Lyra, who waited for him with quiet eyes and the softest smile. He didn't speak, only reached out and took her hand. They walked side by side through the glowing forest, the puppy running ahead, tail wagging. The air felt lighter, the jungle alive again. welcoming them as protectors, not intruders. Back at the cave, Jake set down his pack and removed the metal from his belt, tossing it into the fire. Lyra placed a woven garland around his neck and sang a soft hum that echoed through the crystal walls. The animals gathered again, as if nothing had changed. But something had changed. Jake had chosen not survival, not escape, not orders or medals. He had chosen life, peace, and something real, something gentle in a world that had forgotten how to be soft. The new Bond * morning mist floated low over the glowing grass. As birds with crystal feathers glided from branch to branch, the forest had grown quiet again, calm, alive, untouched by the ship that had come and gone. Jake stood at the edge of the cave, bare feet sinking into the moss, watching the sunrise with a full heart. Lyra stepped beside him, dressed in fresh woven cloth, with vines wrapped like ribbons around her arms. Her eyes caught the golden light, and for a moment, she looked less like an alien and more like a spirit of the land itself. Jake reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation. The puppy, no longer weak or small, raced around their feet in playful circles, barking at falling leaves and snapping at floating seeds. Its fur had become thick and patterned like the jungle around it. A true creature of this world, one raised not by its own kind, but by the kindness of two very different souls. Jake spent his days building now, not just tools, but shelters made of wood, bark, and glowing stones. He carved symbols into walls, taught Lyra English words, and in return, she taught him the names of her plants, the meanings of her hums, and the stories hidden in the wind. One day, she led him to a hidden waterfall deep in the cliffs. Behind it stood a wall covered in glowing vines. She pressed her palm against the rock, and it opened not with gears or technology, but with the whisper of magic. Inside was a chamber filled with carved crystal and painted walls. She showed him drawings of her people, of their beliefs, of the harmony they once lived in before the war. Jake saw symbols of stars, moons, beasts, and children wrapped in light. And then he saw something new, a human figure, drawn in red dust, standing beside a green-skinned figure like Lyra. She looked at him then, her eyes asking a question without words. He stepped forward, picked up the red dust, and added one small thing, a handprint beside the figure, touching hers. She smiled, touched the wall gently, and whispered something he didn't understand, but felt deep inside. The bond between them grew stronger each day, not from passion, but from trust, from shared work and gentle acts. When she was tired, he hummed her song. When he grew frustrated, she brought water in her hands and washed his face until he laughed. When the puppy cried at night, they both rose without complaint. Jake had changed, not just in body but in spirit. He no longer walked like a soldier, no longer slept with one eye open. The war inside him had gone quiet, replaced by something peaceful, something full. He was no longer just surviving, he was living. One afternoon, they found an injured bird tangled in thorn vines. Its wings were broken, and its chest rose and fell in panic. Jake reached for it carefully, whispering softly. Lyra knelt beside him and wrapped her hands around the bird. Closing her eyes together, they hummed not to heal, but to calm. The bird's breathing slowed, and it tucked itself into Lyra's chest. The puppy sniffed it once, then laid beside it, as if protecting it too. Jake looked at Lyra and felt something shift inside him again. Not like before, not just gratitude or affection, but something deeper, something unbreakable. Later that night, he carved a circle of stones beside the fire and placed his army tags inside. Then he covered them with earth and pressed his hand into the dirt. Lyra watched silently, then placed a carved symbol beside it, her people's sign for home. They had buried the past together. As seasons changed, flowers bloomed in places Jake had once walked through as a stranger. Birds nested near their cave. Animals played without fear. Even the forest seemed to hum their rhythm, echoing their daily steps and quiet joys. They hadn't just built shelter, they had built harmony. One morning, As the sun rose in golden fire, Lyra walked to him with the puppy in her arms. She gently placed the creature down and reached into her satchel. From it, she pulled a crystal pendant and tied it around Jake's neck. The stone glowed faintly with her energy, warm to the touch. "Now you are part of this place," she said in her softest voice. "And it is part of you." Jake looked at her, then at the sky, and knew he would never leave, not for orders, not for home, not for anything but her. They stood together at the cliff's edge, wind in their hair, the forest stretching far below like a living sea. The puppy barked happily and leapt into their arms, and the sound of laughter echoed over the treetops, not just his, not just hers, but theirs. Together, they had created something no war could break, no order could erase, and no world could replace.